So you think you have a plan for when the crap hits the fan. You don't. If Moscow and New York City got a 1,000,000-degree suntan tomorrow, how is that going to affect your neighborhood, your street, your neighbors? We're not talking about Hollywood hypotheticals. We're talking about you. If you're serious about surviving the hard times ahead, it's about more than just collecting all the latest survival gear. You need a real plan of action. Today we're going to talk to an intelligence expert on how you can prepare yourself and your neighbors for the complete and utter collapse of civilization as we know it. So let's get to it. Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. We have Mike Shelby, who is a former military intelligence NCO and contract intelligence analyst. He's written a book called the Area Intelligence Handbook, which is a match made in heaven for my audience, who I would encourage you after this video, go and get yourself a copy of this book, because it's going to help you to develop what's called an area study of your local surroundings, help you get better prepared and separate the fantasy, the what ifs, and what's going to happen if the SHTF to here is my actual mission as to what we're going to need to do if disaster strikes in my community. He's going to break down in today's video what exactly an area study is. Now, often preppers are worried about big picture stuff, okay? And I'm guilty as charged. Every day I do my daily global update of all the cataclysmic events around the world, and we're focused on the big strategy as to how we're going to prepare in the future. But oftentimes this is at the expense of preparing for what are going to be the effects in your local community should some of these disasters actually come to pass, and how you're really going to survive. Getting rid of the fantasy about, okay, this is how they did it in the movies. No, how am I going to navigate my local environment when the proverbial shit hits the fan? So, welcome aboard, sir, and it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I love talking about this stuff and spreading the message of area studies.
Yeah, so maybe tell us a bit about the Area Intelligence Handbook and some of its core principles and what compelled you to write this book.
I would say core principles is that we have to deal with our knowledge gaps. So in intelligence, we call them intelligence gaps. They're pieces of information that we need to know but don't know. And so, we can buy gear. Okay, we're going to buy a water filter to deal with, that's how we're going to produce clean water. We're going to buy a rifle for self-defense. We're going to buy, food or whatever to deal with these things. We're going to buy an IFAC or a medical kit to deal with ouchies. Well, what are we doing to deal with information, right? I mean, how are we going to have some kind of knowledge management? And that's a more kind of civilian term, but I mean, really, we have to have an intelligence capacity. And so the first principle is that intelligence is a team sport. I'm a very big proponent of having a local information sharing network of like-minded individuals sharing information. We have to take that information in, we have to put it together. And that's something that we can be running and expanding today. I think there's, like you said, there's such a big focus on like the imminent catastrophic, and we're preparing for that. But what are we doing to prepare for something if that doesn't happen? What are we doing just for, degraded information and communications environment? How are we going to run our local network and deal with political issues and social and economic issues? If there's not an EMP, how are we going to deal with economic calamity? I mean, I live in Central Texas, and I think the United States is headed for economic calamity. That's a catastrophic event. It's not an EMP, but how are we going to deal with that? Well, it takes people, it takes a community. So it really does take an information network or an intelligence network. I would also say we have to understand what our mission is. And if our long-term mission is, okay, we got to win the war. We're going to survive through this thing or whatever happens. Winning the war is really about winning campaigns, which means we've got to be winning the battles. And so, we in the military, we have kind of the strategic, the operational, and the tactical level. So strategic, big picture, long-term. Operational level, that would be like campaigns, like for us, maybe regional, medium term, and then the tactical level, which is the here and the now. And so if we're talking about EMPs or a war with China or whatever happens, we really have to understand the local effects of those big picture events, because that is the level that we can win in. I can't my preparedness group, we can't win on the strategic level. It's too big. But really our task is to win at the local tactical level. And we do that by allowing intelligence to drive our planning and drive our expectations of the future.
Very well said. And one thing that you focus on right when you start the book off, you talk about the consumerism component of preparedness, which is important because these things are all force multipliers, but information will be a commodity. And I think that's is why so many people are watching our daily update videos. And it seems like right now people want information because knowledge is power. And if you have those information gaps, as you say, it doesn't matter what kind of tools you have, you're not going to be prepared to conduct the tactics that you might need in order to win the operation and to hopefully win the conflict. But indeed, we have to focus on these second, third, fourth order effects of these bigger catastrophes, because that is going to be our material reality when the time comes. How do you go about conducting an area study? So if you were to go into somebody's neck of the woods, say, and you were to advise them on, okay, these are some things that you should be looking out for, how would you start that assessment?
Well, the first thing I would do is determine what the mission is. And so the mission can be based on the local threats or the local conditions, but what's the final objective? What's the scenario? Once we understand what the mission is, then we really need to determine some geographic boundaries, right? How far away are we going to have to operate? Or, what's our, what we call the operational environment? What are the local conditions like and how far out do they reach? So once we have established our area of operations, that tells me and everyone else on the team, hey, this is the boundary of our operations. If you find yourself on the other side of this, okay, great. Well, we haven't prepared to go over there. So really defining the boundaries of where we're going to be operating will also define the boundaries of where we're collecting information for the most part. I have 6 layers. These are the 6 layers that I think are the most important for me, that my preparedness group. I'm looking at physical terrain. So, again, starting from your home or your property, your ranch, your bug out location, whatever you have, out to the extent of your area of operations. And then I'm looking at the human terrain. Who are the people? And it's not just the surface level things like, names, identities, demographics. It's what do these people believe about the government, about law enforcement, about the future? Maybe what do these people believe about you? And so we really do have to understand the local human terrain that we're dealing with. And then we move on to critical infrastructure and do the same thing. Politics and governance, safety, security, and defense. So like local law enforcement, first responders, military, that's the 5th layer. Then the 6th layer is economics and finance. And those 6 layers constitute our operating environment. And then, of course, I want to look at the threat environment. And so, those are kind of the parameters. That's the structure of an area study. And that's getting the plans to build the house is always the first step.
So you'd look at the geographical terrain. So you'd be looking at things like natural boundaries, perhaps what your limitations are going to be in terms of travel in this hypothetical scenario. What are some characteristics of the physical terrain? Could you be more specific in terms of some of the things you might be looking for there?
Sure. Yeah. Well, everything goes back to your mission. So if I have to go pick my kid up from school, or I've got to go across town and get my grandmother, or I've got to go down to Houston and help evacuate someone's family out of a hurricane out of Houston, that is going to dictate what physical features, what physical terrain I'm paying attention to. So obviously things like roads, hills, mountains, lakes, any kind of hydrography. So hydrological features. So, rivers. Okay, well, it's a hurricane, right? That's the kind of overall condition we're dealing with. That's the emergency. So obviously rivers could be flooded, or lakes could be flooded, or roads could be flooded over. Well, that's a physical terrain feature that I want to look at. Where are the intersections of bodies of water with roads? And then do we have to cross over those things? It also really depends on what your overall operating environment is. If it's a rural area or it's an urban area. In an urban area, you've got subsurface, you've got surface, you've got above the street level, so like high-rise buildings, and then you've got airspace. So that's way more complex than someone who lives in a rural area, because there's just a massive density of information. So again, everything really kind of comes back to your mission and your environment as to what you're paying attention to.
Maybe to simplify this conversation, we can propose a hypothetical scenario where that people perhaps can relate to. Let's say NATO and Russia go to war. We don't know how it's going to play out, but we know that maybe Article 5 has been invoked. Okay, so we don't know what's going to happen next, right? If you, say, lived in the suburbs, what would you say your physical terrain, how would that factor into this area study for that specific, knowing that there's a potential for things to go nuclear or just a potential for mass panic or hysteria, who knows?
So, I'll give you a real world example. So our it's not really a bug out plan, but we have a family ranch right down the road. So that's our mission, right? Is evacuate in a worst case scenario, evacuate our home and get down to the ranch. So, I'm looking at roadways. Number one, transportation. And what are the conditions of those roadways? If you live in a suburban area and it's 5 p.m., well, a lot of those places are going to be clogged. So, how does that impact our timing of our planning? Number one. Number two, just looking at the possibility for cyber attacks or some other kind of disruption. I'm looking at water. Where are the ponds and lakes around me? Where am I going to get water if all of a sudden I open the faucet and nothing comes out? And actually water is number one, but security features as well. If we get into a worst case scenario where there's long-term disruption and the grocery stores are empty, then people in the suburban areas and urban areas, they might try to start looking for food, out into other areas. And so, the next thing is, well, how am I going to secure the ranch? Or if we stay in town, how am I going to secure my home? And so I'm looking for avenues of approach. So things called lines of drift. How is someone going to get from outside my neighborhood, inside my neighborhood? They're going to drive in, or they're going to walk in on foot. I'm looking for fields of observation. So where can I see in my area immediately? And then what are the places that I can't see? Because there's some kind of cover or concealment there. So cover being, some hard structure, and then concealment just being maybe like a bush or vegetation or a fence that, I really can't see on the other side.
That's one thing that's one downside of any fortification strategy is, and they employ this in Fort Knox, where, they try to give themselves ample line of sight, because you can set up all these barricades and fences, but it's places for people to hide behind to come and infiltrate you, right?
Yeah, there's two sides on a wall, So I look at all these gated mansions, and they have a wall. Well, some of those are, I hate to say it, but there would be firing positions, frankly, if there were an attack on a fixed defensive site like that. So, and there are things we can do to mitigate those kinds of risks. But just from a physical terrain perspective, those are some of my top considerations, really focusing on water first and then security immediately after that. And then, if you have to leave, you got to go to the grocery store, you got to go to Ace Hardware, you got to go wherever. What are those roadways looking like? And what are the conditions, the threat conditions on those areas as well? Which really goes back, I don't want to get too much silent, but it really goes back to the value of information and the value of having an operational intelligence network or an information sharing network. Because when you do have to do that, when you do have to venture outside, and we can't just flip on Twitter or, the news and see what's going on. I've got people feeding me information. So you got to do your area study. You got to build a local information sharing network or intel net.
And fortunately for us, humans are fairly predictable, and they'll tend towards the path of least resistance. If you're walking through a forest, it's a great example. A person is seldom going to veer off the path into chart a new territory. They're going to go in the direction that the path is formed. So in terms of security, structuring your ranch or your homestead or whatever you have in such a way to kind of corral people through corridors, choke points. You might think, oh, I have this huge space to defend, but human psychology dictates that, well, people are going to come and they're going to see this property and they're going to assess it, and they're going to probably go towards the path of least resistance, right? Because evacuation is a big thing, especially up here right now with all the fires going on. I kind of encourage people to look at it as the places like where you instinctively, in a knee-jerk reaction sort of way, the direction, the routes that you want to take when times are good, you got to go on the freeway or, you know, in rush hour, that the fastest way is probably not going to be the fastest way when everything's falling apart. So you might want to consider the back roads, the back alleys, take the long way around, because it'll ultimately be the short way around. Do you have any tips and strategies, like general things about evacuating an area?
Yeah, I mean, if I was like in Escape from Austin or Escape from Houston mode, I would do a lot of ground reconnaissance. I would get out and walk those areas before I had to. I would go and do like a dry run. What does this place look like at 3:45 a.m. versus 3:45 p.m.? And
yeah, just like driving around, like you're saying, and doing. And I think this is where, what you're saying is so important. Is it's imperative that people actually go and just go for a drive, really, right? Like just go and get to know your neighborhood at different times of the day, like you're saying, and find alternate routes, because 99% of people are just going to do what they're conditioned to do. Oh, I got to get out. What's the fastest way? Oh, the freeway. They're stuck on the freeway,
When I was a kid, we had a snowstorm, and so we're all out of school, which is pretty rare. And I was going to go over to my cousin's house because we were going to go slide. He had this big hill in the backyard. And so, my mom was like, okay, well, let's get out a map and, show me what route you're going to walk. And she started looking at the roads. I'm like, I'm cutting through these people's backyard. It's like, I got a beeline, straight line right to his house. I'm not walking all over the roads. So, it's exactly that kind of stuff. Get out your map, do a map reconnaissance, look at some areas, maybe you might call them corridors. Look at some of these mobility corridors or areas that you think you might want to transit, mark those on a map, then get out and conduct, a leader's reconnaissance, or get out and walk and just sit, and also just observe, just get the baseline, that guy or that vehicle, or, there's a lot of foot traffic in this area. And, that can help determine your plan. So what you're going to do just based on the baseline activity at that given moment or time.
Do you have any advice on how to conduct like an objective observation? Because so often it's easy to go and look at a scenario and project all of your own beliefs and ideas of how something should function. How does a person just observe in the most objective way possible in order to absorb the most amount of information about an environment? Yeah,
that's good. The best skills of observation are developed through practice. So I'll give you a really good example. So one of our we teach a reconnaissance course, and one of our reconnaissance instructors, I asked him to describe what he's seeing in a particular moment. And then I asked a student to describe what he's seeing in a particular moment. And there were just about 100 additional details that Sam gave, our recon guy, that the student didn't. And it's obviously not to put the student down. It is that unless we go out and deliberately observe, we're going to miss a lot of things. And so, yeah, there are a number of things that you can do. Just start one way, start on the ground. What are the conditions on the ground? Like, what's this? How thick is the soil? What are the conditions of this road? Okay. Are there any signs of subsurface features? Like, is there, a pipeline warning, or is there a culvert or canal or something like that below ground? And then work your way up from the ground up to the sky and observe what you see. There's a reason why for a long time in the Army, I don't even know if they still do this, but you had to sketch out your range cards, right? And you had your left and right limits of fire, and you have to sketch out exactly what you see in that area. And so getting out a range card and filling that out and literally drawing what you see, I think, is another thing, because then you're forced to look at those details.
So you notice a huge discrepancy between a seasoned intelligence gatherer, if you will, and somebody who is just kind of getting in as a student. You see a big difference there.
Yeah, I mean, it's like saying, okay, Mike, we're going to go build a doghouse today. And then you go get this, professional carpenter of 40 years, and you say, okay, Tom, you're going to go build a doghouse today. And it's going to take him about 10% of the time, and it's going to be built a heck of a lot better than my doghouse would be. So it's just like any other skill. But yeah, absolutely.
So it is a skill, and I think that's important, because it's not the most tangible of things for people to conceptualize, but indeed the ability to look at a location in a way which is objective, and you're able to absorb all that information and figure out what are the key things that I should be focusing on and things that I shouldn't be distracted with. That's very good. That's a very interesting exercise I think people can do by themselves. I think, the physical terrain component is probably, I don't want to say easy, but it's the most tangible thing that people can wrap their heads around. The human component of all this is, I think, where things get complicated. What can you say about intelligence gathering about the human element in one's community? How does one go about doing that?
Well, here in Central Texas, for instance, we have a substantial part of the population who speaks Spanish at home, like 20, 30%. And so that data point alone says, Mike, you probably should be fluent in Spanish, because during an emergency, you may be in a scenario where it would behoove you to be fluent. And so, I think that is one way to look at the human terrain, right? I mean, what languages are spoken in your area? And just off the top of my head, but, really also look into like cultural issues and religious issues. There's a difference. I'm a very big proponent of informing and influencing. And so if I were going to go try, we have some Mormons in our area, and I'm not Mormon. If I were going to go try to inform and influence a Mormon, I would probably find a Mormon to go do that on my behalf instead of me, And so, I think just looking at all the different cultures in an area, it is also a very good way to analyze your area, just to see what you have in there. And then when you go build your network, it's like, well, I don't really have any eyes into the local Hispanic community here, but I know they're at the flea market every other Saturday, and there's about 1,000 of them over there. So, knowing that flea market's over there, knowing that they are there, hey, that's my target audience. Like, if I want to go meet those people, that's somewhere that I'm going to go meet those people. And so, looking at your area and really seeing where those people are gathered and where those people live and where those people go. I would also include Spanish language stations. We have radio stations here broadcast in Spanish. And so, who is listening to those types of broadcasts? I would definitely include that in my human terrain analysis.
Okay, so we have culture, we have religion. I know politics is its own category of area study, but I suppose there's an overlap there as well, because one would want to know perhaps who were in various positions of authority within the region and who would be the ones that are essentially telling people where to go when disaster strikes, or who would try to do that thing, right? Who would be the guy who comes around and knocks on the door and says, hey, we're going to need you to blah, blah, blah. How do you factor that into your planning?
Well, just politics in general. I have a political overlay of my neighborhood. So, if I haven't met them, I've looked them up. You can do like a reverse white pages search and, at least find the owner of the house. And, there are websites where you can go look these people up, look at their political campaign contributions. And it's not I'm not saying these are good or bad people. They may, in fact, be very bad people. But that's just a data point that I want to know. And so if I find someone who is politically simpatico, like, oh, we donated to the same guy, hey, I've got something in common with that guy. That is a really key part of building rapport. So I want to go try to meet those people in my neighborhood, right? I might just get out and walk around more in the evenings. I'm like, oh, this guy gets home at 5:45. Well, I'm going to be walking, past his driveway around the time he gets home and maybe strike up a conversation. Why? Because I know we have something in common. That's a very good starting point. So I think looking at those types of data points will also help you meet more people and build your local intelligence network. And these people, they don't have to, I don't have to say, oh, hey, Tom, I have an intelligence network that I would like you to be a part of. I might get there eventually, but Tom doesn't have to know that, what he's doing. He's just a source of information that I can, I'll get his phone number and text him, or, if I see him. So I think that's one reason why we should really understand the local political terrain, especially in our neighborhoods.
Do you think, though, that politics alone is going to be enough to ensure camaraderie under austere conditions? Because I could see a scenario.
No, absolutely not.
I could see a scenario where people might even enter a relationship in that way and assume, maybe become naive to the fact that, okay, we have all these things in common. But, when things get weird, I almost imagine that in a post-collapse environment, if you will, politics almost becomes, will become less, how should I say, less hardline in their belief. Like it will almost be like we need politics to navigate the world right now. But when you're hungry and you need stuff and people have stuff, it doesn't really matter what it does to an extent. I'm sure those ideologies, values that you have are going to determine in some cases how you respond to the situation. But I think there's also a risk that a person might enter into an agreement and underestimate, the person because, we both like, person X, so therefore, so how do you manage those risks?
Politics is just a single data point. So, of course I would be looking for other signs of, of character and ideology, of course. To answer your question, I would say that that trust is a two-way street, and I would want to do things potentially judge someone's character. One thing that we do locally, we go on camping trips, and okay, so Tom, he believes 99% of the same things we do, but we're a half a mile into a 5-mile hike and he's already complaining. So he's ideologically simpatico, but he's probably not the guy I really want to trust when the going gets tough.
Yeah, exactly. I've had many friends and acquaintances in the past where, ideologically we overlap, but under stressful conditions, people can change. And, I usually give people the opportunity to see, okay, is this just a temporary thing? Or a hike is a great example. That's actually a really good test to learn a lot about a person, is how, put them in a situation where they have to test their endurance in some way, shape, or form to see, what they're truly made of and where the potential sticking points are probably going to be. And so in terms of identifying human threats then in the environment, is there any other tools that a person can use to, a lot of what you're talking about it seems like investigative work, like going in and investigating various people, doing these reverse white page searches and whatnot. How does a person acquire information about the people in their communities?
Well, social media, it's pretty ubiquitous. And so I would say, even that's one place to start. I think the best way for any individual, especially just starting off, to build their own information sharing network. And again, these people don't have to be, we're called witting sources. They can be unwitting sources, unwittingly providing me information, is go get involved in local groups, right? There are networks and there's charitable organizations, religious groups, political groups already established. Just start going and start rubbing elbows in those circles and just meet people. And so that's, those guys may not all live in my neighborhood, but, eventually I might come across someone who does. So I think between social media and then getting out, this is, you're right, it is investigative work. A lot of collection is, okay, we've got our collection requirement. We're looking for this specific piece of information. Now let's look in the area. Who would have this specific kind of information? Okay, great. We got a guy. And okay, great. Now, how do we go and build a relationship with him, or how much development is going to be required before this guy can give us this piece of information? Because I'm not just going to go ask him off the street. And a lot of that absolutely is just 100% investigation, especially in the beginning phases.
Yeah, and some of the threats I'd probably be looking at were obviously anybody who was struggling with addiction issues, people who have a criminal record, people who are gang affiliated, perhaps. What is your take on overly dogmatic people? And not as a judgment against people who are religious. I have nothing against people who are religious, or I think there's a lot of positives to religion, and then there's potentially some downsides if it goes into some more extreme domains. But what is your take of how that's going to factor into these types of situations? Because you've probably seen the trope about, the person who starts sacrificing people after the shit hits the fan, right? The classic cult leader who everybody falls for. And I mean, this is a real thing. Like this is a real thing that's happened time and time again throughout history. How do you suss out those types of people and how they're going to factor into your area analysis?
Well, this is a part of understanding the local human terrain. Religion, just like race or sports or politics or ideology, that can be a tribalistic identity, right? When that is a real core piece of someone's identity. First of all, I take note of that and say, this person ascribes a very high level of value to this specific identity, whatever it is. And just on a psychological level, I think that's one thing you have to take note of at an individual level. But, the next thing, now all of a sudden, this guy's not an individual. Now he's a part of this tribalized group. And if I have done some homework, then I want to know more about this group, starting with their history. Hey, 3 years ago, they really got into this big argument with this other tribalized group. Well, maybe good to know. And we ran into that in Afghanistan. Every time we'd go build a well in some village, there are tribes and sub-tribes, especially among the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. And so, we'd go go dig a well or build a school or whatever. And this other sub-tribe, down the road that says, oh, the Americans are building something over there in that village. Well, they must hate us because we really hate these other guys down the road. And so, all of a sudden now you're on the outs with someone else. So really, I hope American or Western tribal dynamics doesn't get that bad. I think probably the direction where we're going in low intensity conflict, I think there's a very good chance that they will worsen. And so, for lack of a better term, I would say understanding the local tribal dynamics, the political dynamics, we're talking about influence. You brought up cults. So they're informal power centers, and then there are formal power centers. Informal power centers are like elected officials, and informal power centers, might be someone on the board of directors on a company who has a lot of influence there, or a church leader, a member of the clergy, or someone in a school system or whatever. So I really want to understand those informal power centers as well. And the more we understand the local social dynamics of an area, the better we're going to be able to navigate it during an emergency.
And do you think when things deteriorate, do people tend to drift more towards the informal power structures as opposed to the formal? You would think that you would, in order to enforce and authorize the formal power structure, would require everything functioning as is. Whereas when those things start to break down, people might gravitate towards who they know, the community leader, as opposed to, the head, whatever politician.
Yeah, I think there can be a lot of overlap between the level of influence and someone who has a formal influence and someone who has informal. It's certainly something to take note of. If you look at an area like a failed state or a place where the government's run out of legitimacy, and maybe they're questioning the government's authority or questioning, the right of a government to be in place, like we've seen in a lot of other countries. That formal power breaks down and everything gets relegated back to informal power and informal leaders who could be tribal or religious or whatever, or ethnic or whatever. And so, I think that's a good observation that, when formal power structures break down, I agree, everything tends to be relegated back to informal power structures.
So all the more reason to get to know who are those people with a lot of gravitational sway in your community when times are good. And I think it's fairly easy to identify who these people are. Like you're saying, they're religious leaders. I know, in the southern U.S. that plays a big role in a lot of people's lives, and numerous places. I mean, not just there, but, like you're saying, could be a principal at a school, or, it could be a variety of different people. It could be people who are not necessarily good people either. It could be gang leaders, And or it just could be a sheriff who, you know, the people respect more than they do the mayor, you know, or whatever, you know. And this, you'll find that the real power actually lies in these informal structures as opposed to the formal. But that's a very interesting distinction there. All the more reason you guys got to go and get that book, man. I'm telling you, everything we're talking about here today, he breaks it down in a very easy to understand fashion and a very dispassionate way, which is always good when we're trying to look at these kind of things, because again, it's easy to project our values and our beliefs and all this stuff, and that contaminates the observation. So the approach that you're taking here and the objectivity that you're promoting is necessary. What about critical infrastructure in terms of doing an area study? What are people looking for?
Whatever keeps your world spinning. So, you know, we start with, what do I really need? Well, it's, you know, it's in the summer in Texas. Like, I want power because I want my AC to run. And then let's, you know, maybe go down another level. Well, we got AC. So what happens if my AC unit breaks? Well, where are the spare parts? So now where are the hardware stores, and where can I get spare parts for these things? And actually, I got to back up. I got to start with water. How does water get into how does clean drinking water get into my house, and where does that come from? That's number one. Absolutely.
Most people don't know.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, most
people don't know where the actual water reservoir that they drink comes from. Like, ask like I'm sure 90% of people, if you ask them this question on the street, they wouldn't know. It doesn't matter what city they're from.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And then, one step below that is we go back to the physical terrain just briefly. And, where's standing water in my neighborhood? Like, oh, there's a gully or a creek or a ditch or whatever, and there's some standing water there. Well, water goes out of my house. Well, I'm filling buckets down at the creek or whatever. And so, that's another, I always start with water. So next, after water and power and utilities, we're looking at things like government buildings, gas stations. Whenever I teach tactical intelligence courses, I always ask students, raise your hand if you think a Walmart or a Target is critical infrastructure. It absolutely is. All that cheap stuff that used to be cheap stuff we bought at Walmart, that keeps our world spinning. That is absolutely critical infrastructure. And that goes for hardware stores and everything else too. And then we can go to like oil storage and natural resources, timber yards, national forests, I would say, is part of the critical infrastructure. And, it's kind of, everything is really dependent on your situation.
You got me thinking about water, like the watering hole dynamics. In the Serengeti, every animal converges around the watering hole, because that's where you got to be. If you don't risk, you got to risk life and limb to get water. So there's going to be lions down there. There's going to be gazelles. There's going to be, crocodiles, all this kind of stuff, hippos, and they have to risk getting down to the water. So just the dynamic of that in itself, if there's only one standing water source in your region, you're going to have to go down there and fetch water, and there's going to be this competition for resources there. You're going to have to be putting yourself around other people. If you don't have a rain catchment system, or you don't have ample water storage or whatever, or you're going to be forced to go to the watering hole. And, it's a colorful way of illustrating, that concept of the tribalism that could ensue there, because you could have a situation like Book of Eli where, one gang runs the watering hole, and you got to pay a toll or whatever, you could imagine these things unfolding and becoming a part of the calculus of how you're going to navigate this new world, right?
Yeah. And, I get asked, Mike, under what conditions would you bug out? Number one, if my water gets disrupted, I'm not staying there, because water goes, and then health and disease and everything else goes after that. So yeah, that's why water is the number one element of my area study. Start there for sure.
I don't know where you live. Like, if you live in a place that's close to bodies of water, we have a river here. Half the season it's winter, so there is an abundant water source. If you can melt it down, if if you can find an energy efficient way to get that into liquid form. But yeah, that's going to be, on the topic of that, while we're on the topic of bugging out, is there any other criteria that you would use to determine when is it essential to bug out?
Yeah, there's only one other thing, and that would be either a lack of manpower or, in a worst case scenario, being outgunned. The great thing about having an intelligence network is, we have access to people, and we can find people. We can find manpower if we need it. And kind of the same thing, I'm a big proponent of starting or joining a local neighborhood watch. Why? Because those are sensors. In the Army, we said every soldier is a sensor. Well, every person in your community is also a sensor. And the more sensors you have, the more manpower you potentially can have as well. And so if there were a case where maybe, a local gang, and not necessarily even like a street gang or drug gang, a local group of bubbas all of a sudden decided that they wanted to enforce their will on me, and I found that intolerable. I don't really have a lot of options. So that's probably the only other thing that would make me leave an area if I couldn't compete for power and influence in an area. That's probably number 2. If we're to get into an Article 5 situation, I think there's a very good chance that we're really talking about World War III.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.